Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jack Daly, the John and Adrian Mars Director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, and it's my privilege to welcome you all, those here in the hall and those participating via webcast and NASA TV, to the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics Centenary, a symposium on 100 years of aerospace research and development. For making this program possible, we are grateful to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and the partnership between the Smithsonian and NASA has existed for decades, but the relationship between the Smithsonian and NACA began a century ago. Charles Walcott, the fourth Secretary of the Smithsonian, urged that NACA be established and later served as its chairman. As a scientist, he understood the essential role research would play in flight technology. Furthermore, he realized the country's best interest would be best served by bringing people with skill, expertise, courage, and foresight together. He and the other visionaries who helped create the NACA would be very proud of the groundbreaking achievements accomplished by the agency. Today, NASA is on the cusp of a new era in space exploration, accomplishing its goals by exercising all the qualities that made the NACA great: innovation, courage, hard work, diligence, curiosity, optimism, passion, brilliance, and the list goes on. Its agenda may be broader than it was 100 years ago, and its budget certainly is larger than the $5,000 appropriated by Congress to start the NACA, but the mission remains the same: the pursuit of excellence. Enjoy the symposium, and congratulations to all of you who are continuing in the footsteps of this history-making organization. And it's my honor now to turn the podium over to the Administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the Honorable Charles Bolden.
Thank you very much, General Daly, and Roger, thanks for organizing all this. Thanks all of you for coming out. This is, it's a long time in coming. 100 years is quite a long time. There are some of us who are a lot closer to it now than we were quite some time ago, and it's interesting to see it approach in your life, but who knows? We appreciate all the work that the Smithsonian staff has done to host this symposium about the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA. Both NASA and the NACA have had a long and very fruitful relationship with the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, as General Daly mentioned. In fact, it is literally on display all around us. Walking through the museum to this gallery today, it's hard to miss the bright orange X-1 hanging in the Milestones of Flight gallery. Right nearby it, we saw the intimidating matte black X-15, and above the escalators, the gleaming white D558 skyrocket. These amazing vehicles were all developed under NACA, and one, the X-15, was actually flown by NASA. We're thrilled that these artifacts are lovingly preserved and displayed here on the National Mall for millions of visitors from around the world to see. But our relationship with this museum goes beyond finding a good home for historic air and spacecraft. The NASA History Program and the museum have a long tradition of working together to advance the historical study of our aerospace heritage. Today's event is a perfect example. It's been 100 years to the day since the law passed creating the NACA. Through our joint efforts, we've assembled an amazing group of experts and young scholars to discuss the legacy and lessons of this incredible group. For those of us who are pilots and who have taken the next giant leap into space, I can honestly say we wouldn't be here where we are without the first steps taken by those pioneers who had the foresight to see where the new technology of aviation could take us. Today, every U.S. aircraft and U.S. air traffic control tower has NASA-developed technology on board. It has never been more true that NASA is with you when you fly. Back in the 1960s, however, In the enthusiasm of tackling the new mission, space, it was easy for both NASA and the public to forget about the NACA. There were exciting and very demanding new challenges to face, and as great as the NACA had been, it was yesterday's news. As time went by, it was easy to forget the fundamental contributions made by the NACA to the worldwide development of aeronautics. The huge contributions made by the NACA staff that helped our nation to victory in World War II, security during the Cold War, and to research that laid the basis for our space program also faded to memory. But there were a few things that didn't fade, things that came into NASA at the transition along with the researchers, staff, facilities, and aircraft. These critical bits of NACA DNA shaped the mold that made NASA, made us who we are today. The first of these was how we work. In partnership with industry, academia, even museums, I should note, and innovators throughout the world. The second major influence of the NACA on NASA was in what we do. Like our predecessors studying the shape of airfoils in the first wind tunnels at the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory, NASA is focused on practical solutions at the cutting edge of technology. This is especially true of our continuing work on aeronautics, where we are committed to transforming aviation by dramatically reducing its environmental impact, maintaining safety in more crowded skies, and paving the way to revolutionary aircraft shapes and propulsion. Finally, another inheritance from the NACA is in literally who we are. One of the great keys of success of the NACA was the uncanny ability of Director of Aeronautical Research George Lewis to find inquisitive, inspired, and devoted people who could look at a problem, collect and analyze the data, and come up with often counterintuitive solutions. The NACA's mission was a magnet for those sorts of people, and NASA has maintained that tradition. Today, the same forward thinking and innovation is fueling our journey to Mars. Our commercial partners are developing new systems to carry astronauts to low Earth orbit from American soil, and NASA is working on the Orion spacecraft and the Space Launch System that will take them farther into deep space than ever before. Standing on the shoulders of giants who first set us on this journey of discovery and reaching higher, we're going to make the impossible possible again. So, while some of the inheritance and accomplishments of the NACA are well known, there is much that is not. I hope that over the next 2 days, you'll have a very productive symposium. Like those NACA employees of the last century, don't be afraid to take a hard look at the data and follow it to the conclusion. I'm counting on you to reveal knowledge and lessons from the past that will help us in the next 100 years of aerospace research. Good luck. Have a good time over the next couple of days. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am Roger Launius. I am Associate Director for Collections and Curatorial Affairs here at the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum. We're ready to begin with the first presentation, and I'm going to talk about what is the NACA model of research and development. And there's some controversy about that, to be perfectly honest. What I would like to explore this morning is let's see if I can make this go. Am I missing something? Okay. That doesn't seem to help. Oh, there we go. All right. This is my game plan for today, or using an aeronautical term, my angle of attack, to talk through a little bit of an introduction about the R&D structure that the NACA created, and then 3 case studies of how that particular model unfolded over time. And I do this specifically with the objective in mind of focusing on some questions that have come to light about what is the proper role forward for NASA as it moves into the 21st century. And there are those who have suggested that we should return to the NACA roots and proceed with a model of research that is built upon that particular heritage. I'll talk more about that in a moment, but let me just suggest to you that that return to the NACA model, to fully understand it, we have to look at the roots of the NACA itself. And of course, as we all know, 100 years ago today, as a rider to the Naval Appropriations Act, there was an indication that there should be the creation of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. And in the charter, very specifically it said to supervise and direct the scientific study of the problems of flight with a view to their practical solution, and to determine the problems which should be experimentally attacked, and to discuss their solution and their application to practical problems. If there is anything about this that's not perfectly understandable, I would be surprised, but especially that practical solution part was one that was really significant. Less concerned about theoretical questions, more concerned about the practical nature of stuff. So what was the NACA model for aerospace research and development over time? Obviously, aviation was created in the United States. The Wright brothers were the first to fly. Tom Crouch is in the audience. He's been battling that particular question for years. And he will tell you point blank, and I will do the same, that the Wrights were the first to do so on December 17th, 1903, on the sands near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. It was a remarkable event, and in the invention of the airplane, within a decade, the technological capabilities had largely moved offshore to Europe. There were a lot of reasons for that. Part of it was the Wright brothers themselves and their patent wars with other manufacturers. And the NACA was in part a specific attempt to recover from that doldrums that the United States found itself in by the middle part of the aughts, or the 15s, the 10s and 15s of the early period. But as the NACA emerged, it undertook a research objective that was focused largely on supporting industry, at least that was the case initially. And there are those who've suggested we should return to that particular model. You know this picture. Newt Gingrich, Speaker of the House in the 1990s, in 1995 famously made the comment that he thought that at the end of Apollo, NASA should have been returned to its NACA roots. It should have modified the way in which it did things. And as it stood at that time, he said it had become obsolescent. He is not the first politician, nor would he be the last to make such a statement. That has been happening periodically since that time. It's also been the case beforehand. And there is also those who've made more serious efforts to try to understand what that might mean. Charles Miller, who was a NASA official for a number of years and is still very active, is a very astute observer of lots of things, but one of the approaches that he pursued was an attempt to try to understand what it meant to undertake an NACA-style research effort. And this is a slide. The lower right of this particular screen shows a slide from one of his presentations in which he said, industry is the customer and NASA should return to a model in which it is supporting industry. His guiding principle, which he stated as clearly as could be stated, build an industry, not a program. As far as he was concerned, NASA had a set of programs, mostly focused on spaceflight. They really ought to be working to support industry in a more specific and causative manner. And he looked to some of the lessons of the early NACA as an example of how this might be done. develop a consensus on what needed to be done, unleash engineers and scientists to pursue those particular questions, prepare reports, studies, analyses, and make those available to the outside world. He also believed that stop the big projects, undertake very small things. In his particular vision, if you're going to fail, fail fast and move on. This is one approach, and this is a very specific idea about how an NACA-style approach might take place. The question is this really the NACA model? And I would suggest to you that only partially so. The classic model, and he sort of outlined it, Charles sort of outlined it in the slide previously, was established by the 1920s, and it stayed in place for some period of time, but was subsumed by other activities later on. Obviously, research questions that came from industry and the military is a part of this. Those went to the NACA main committee. They were parsed down to technical subcommittees. They were apportioned out to, through research authorizations to the NACA facilities, the laboratories that were engaged in research. That research took a variety of forms. There was obviously some theoretical work. There was certainly ground research, especially using wind tunnels that became the first and earliest, and in some respects, most significant, at least pre-World War II, set of activities that the NACA was engaged in. You armed a bunch of really smart engineers with cutting-edge instruments, in this case wind tunnels, to do some stunning work. And that ground research translated into flight research as well. All of that ended up as a technical report. Throughout this process, there's feedback loops back to industry, military, or whoever the customer might be. That is a very stylized, very simplistic, but very basic model of how that research was conducted. But there's more to it than that, obviously. And there are a couple of ingredients to this that I haven't really talked about yet, but one of them is quite important, I believe, and that was the NACA report structure. Pearl Young, who you see pictured in this particular slide, came to the NACA's Langley Laboratory in 1922, and she essentially established the research reporting requirements that became a standard for the NACA throughout its history and is the predecessor of the current technical reporting system that exists at NASA today. It was a very structured top-down approach. She ruled with an iron fist. I don't think there's anybody who would disagree with that. In terms of how reports were done, how they were approved, how there were concurrences that were created, and how they were distributed. And it was a highly successful program. It became so in the 1920s. It has remained so right up to the present in terms of technical reporting. There are a variety of reports that came out of that. Obviously, the most significant of those was the technical report, a fully developed, well-structured, completely well-argued report that was fully understandable to virtually any engineer who would pick it up with the background and training to read it. And it went to all manner of outside sources and was useful in that sense. There were a variety of other reports beyond that. I won't go through them all. Most of them were of a lesser formal nature, but nonetheless provided useful technical information to the outside community. Had they been creating this in the first part of the 21st century, I'm sure this would have been done electronically, but in those days it was all printed and distributed through a very structured process. And it worked exceptionally well. And with the exception of classified reports and those that were done for particular clients that was confidential in nature, those were pretty much freely available to whomsoever needed them. Beginning in 1926, there was also what has come to be known as the NACA inspection, or what amounts to an industry conference. And here you can see a photograph of the participants of one of those industry conferences in the 1930s, taking in the full-scale tunnel down at what is now the Langley Research Center, in those days the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory. And it's obviously a photograph that was posed, but you get a sense of the size of these particular activities and something about the broad-based nature of who was involved. These were very useful exercises. The NACA was able to show off its research capabilities. It was also able to hear from all of the participants their particular needs, desires, and wants when it came to research topics and the kind of knowledge that they were seeking that might be useful to them. And those often got translated into research authorizations that would then find their way to NACA researchers at Langley and later on at Ames and Lewis laboratories, and were useful in a variety of settings as they pursued their technological capabilities. I should mention, by the way, that photograph of the full-scale tunnel, that tunnel has been demolished. It was a National Historic Landmark, but there was a need at Langley to do other things with that space, so there was the proper documentation and all of the undertakings that are necessary for a historic landmark. And we saved, and we have just mounted in our Milestones of Flight Hall. You should go over there at some point during our conference and genuflect before it. One of the two fans that powered the wind tunnel. It is a stunning, huge, impressive, somewhat overpowering object that, that bespeaks the significance of the wind tunnel effort in general at the NACA, but also of the particular efforts of that full-scale wind tunnel, which was a remarkable facility from the point that it was first inaugurated in the 1930s until it was finally decommissioned in the 1990s. Now, the NACA efforts of the 1920s, the reporting structure that was created, the process whereby information flowed from industry, military, whoever, to the NACA researchers, the research authorization process to create the formalized structure whereby a particular research project could unfold, served very well, especially in that 1920s and 30s time frame. As the NACA undertook enormously significant aerodynamics research, especially aerodynamics, but also later on got into propulsion and a few other areas as well. And at some level, it helped to fuel the aeronautical revolution of that particular era. I show a picture here of a DC-3, perhaps the quintessential airplane of the 1930s as the industry and aviation as a whole moved from biplanes made out of wood and canvas to metal monoplanes with capabilities to do a lot more than anything that was available before that time. The Boeing 247, the DC-3 from Douglas, are exemplars of that particular research effort. And the NACA's role in making those possible is well known, I think, to most of the people in this particular room. But it was a significant development forward, and the NACA's role in furthering those capabilities was quite real. That is, in some respects, the classic model that Charles Miller and others have pointed to when they talk about the NACA role, the NACA model of research and development. And it's that 20s and 30s concept. It changed in World War II, pretty fundamentally. There's still some efforts to do the same type of work, no question about it. But there's much more move toward other bigger activities. Oh, I should also say something about navigational systems. And I love the particular picture on the left of of Salt Lake City, of Temple Square, the Mormon Temple. You see in the distance, and the famous Mormon Tabernacle in the foreground, with a sign on top of the Mormon Tabernacle that says Salt Lake Airport with an arrow pointing in one direction. that was a very common navigational system early on. And that's one of the reasons why on the tops of train stations all around the United States, they usually painted the name of the town. It's a navigational system. And this was put onto the top of the Mormon Tabernacle in 1924. It remained there until 1947, to give you a sense of how that was useful. Air traffic control, of course, was rudimentary, and you can see an example of that from about 1931. But some of that technology was matured in NACA laboratories. And of course, the NACA and its successor, NASA, have continued to be involved in this particular type of research right up to the present. I love this picture from Ames Research Center of its Air Traffic Control Center of the future, and efforts to try to move forward in this particular arena right up to today. There is no part of an airplane that has not been touched by the NACA and NASA over time, or of any part of the infrastructure associated with flight in the United States that has not been a part of the NACA-NASA effort. This is one example of it. Now, as World War II progressed, and especially in the aftermath of World War II, there are modifications to this NACA model. It's no longer just let's take some research questions from an outside entity, let's move forward with internal research efforts and publish reports. It moves in a much different direction. And the signature programs of the NACA in the aftermath of World War II are fundamentally public-private partnerships in which the military is involved, NASA's or NACA, and later on NASA is involved, and so are the industry individuals. The classic example of this, and you can see this image of many of the X-planes from the post-World War II era, and in the center, of course, is the orange Bell X-1 that is the project that I'd just like to talk about ever so briefly. The Bell X-1, an attempt to pursue supersonic flight in the aftermath of World War II, became a very early partnership, a very successful one, in which the Army Air Forces and later the U.S. Air Force participated in the program as a full partner along with Bell Aviation and the NACA. That particular effort was totally successful, and we all know the stories of Chuck Yeager and the first flight faster than the speed of sound in October of 1947 as a result of that. But it wasn't just a stunt, and that's a very important thing to understand. There was a very firm research program, and it was intellectually led by the NACA. And people such as John Stack at the Langley Laboratory, as well as Walt Williams, who took the leadership of the NACA operation in Muroc, out in the dry lake beds of Southern California, really provided the intellectual illumination necessary to proceed with this. The industry in Bell Aircraft was also a full partner in this process, but so was the Air Force, contributing much of the money, and obviously critical personnel, among them Chuck Yeager, to this particular effort. And it was enormously successful, not just for a one-off stunt, kick the tires and fly the thing faster than the speed of sound, but a reasoned research program in which they incrementally moved from subsonic through transonic and into supersonic flight. A very useful set of activities. They fully deserved the Collier Trophy that they received for these particular efforts. Now, I want to say one thing about some efforts that have been made to try to say Chuck Yeager was not the first person to fly faster than the speed of sound. And a North American test pilot by the name of Wheaties Welch, and some of you may know that name, presumably flew an F-86 experimental flight faster than the speed of sound just a few days before the famous flight of the Bell X-1. Did he or didn't he? Who knows? There are people who say that they heard sonic booms. Fine. There are people who say they've seen UFOs. Does that make it true? But Walt Williams had the best response to any of this. And it really bespeaks the NACA approach to how they did everything. Okay, if he did this, show me the data. There is no data to show. Personally, I doubt he did it. If he did, he probably did it in a dive, and had he done so, he probably would have pulled the wings off. But nonetheless, Williams's response was really an appropriate one, I think, in a lot of ways. So that's another model, a public-private partnership in which everybody brings something to the table and is successful at doing this. The NACA mastered this in the aftermath of World War II, and they did it repeatedly with the X-plane series. The great example, which spills into the NASA era, is the X-15, of course. Research reports are very much a part of this process, but also the direct data that it is transmitted in a variety of different ways. And these become projects that look more like what NASA does down the road than what the NACA did in a pre-World War II era, at least in my opinion. The NACA also began to reach into space in that period after World War II, and in this particular instance, I would suggest to you that the projects that they were involved in look even more like what we would come to know as NASA research and development efforts and the programs of space exploration that emerged in the 1960s. In 1944, Jerome Hunsaker, many of you are familiar with him, basically wrote a letter in which he said, you know, we really need to start exploring these issues. That we have to work on propulsion and aerodynamics and materials and all the other questions associated with very high-speed flight for national security purposes, for guided missile development, for a variety of other reasons, and maybe even to explore space. And those are efforts that we need to try to focus on right now. So the NACA's interest in missiles and rockets comes right at the end of World War II, and they begin to move out on this in 1945 and 46. They create, in August of 1946, a formal organization to lead this effort, the Pilotless Aircraft Research Division, located at the Langley Laboratory under the leadership of Robert Gilruth. And many of you are familiar with Robert Gilruth, who would go on to lead the Space Task Group as the person with the most experience associated with rockets and missiles, to lead the experience to develop Project Mercury in 1959, 60, and 61, and ultimately to found and be the first director of the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston when it was created, and obviously renamed the Johnson Space Center in 1973. They built a facility where they could launch these rockets out at Wallops Island. It's still in existence. It's being used for a lot more than just these little tiny rockets that the PARD was engaged in at that particular point in time. But there is an aerial view of the research station that was on Wallops Island. There's not much to it. You can see a few buildings there, and you can see a ramp down on the southern part, down on the bottom part of that particular image, where they would use as a guide to launch these little missiles off out into the ocean. I've already talked about this. Robert Gilruth served as the head of PARD, and most of the early people associated with human spaceflight in NASA in that late 50s, early 60s period come out of that particular organization. They were working in the transonic realm initially. They moved into supersonic. They tried to get to hypersonic and never made it, but nonetheless, they were engaged in those particular activities. They developed small, solid propellant rockets that were pretty successful in terms of understanding what was happening. Once again, it's a research project. Their intent is to gather knowledge, and they were quite successful at doing that. They launched something for the first time on the 4th of July in 1945, even before the Pilotless Aircraft Research Division was created at Langley, but nonetheless, they were able to do it. Here's the initial Czech launch of a small rocket, and you can see it's not terribly impressive. But it's every journey has to start somewhere, and this is where this particular started. Rockets got a little bit bigger. You can see they're not terribly large, but this is an October 1945 test launch. Another small particular rocket, testing ballistic shapes, testing wings and what might work. The research from this fed into other activities that NASA had, especially with the X-1 and other projects afterwards. But all of those activities helped with the development of rocket technology. And of course, they didn't end there. This is actually after NASA is created, but in 1959, launching out of Wallops on a small booster, but still much larger than those early ones, the Little Joe, which tested the ballistic capsule for the Mercury program. So there's a succession of efforts throughout this period in which the NACA is engaged in ever more sophisticated research associated with rocketry and spaceflight. And that is a different model. Yes, they were able to provide knowledge to other organizations like the military, but they are also using this to feed back into their own efforts. And it looks a whole lot more like the NASA efforts for Project Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo than do some of the other NACA efforts of the time. All right, well, let me just wrap this up by making some comments. There is a classic model of NACA research, and it's not a bad model in a whole lot of ways, in which research questions come from a variety of sources. There are projects that are undertaken to try to learn the answers to those questions, and that data is provided to whomsoever wishes to have it. It's not just an industry. It never was just an industry thing. It was not necessarily just about building an industry, although that was certainly a part of the task. But it's a moving target. It never stays static. And so when we talk about returning to the NACA roots, we have to ask the question, what roots are we talking about? There is then obviously public-private partnerships associated with the X-plane programs of the 1940s and 50s, and of course into the 1960s and 70s that NASA pursued. And then obviously the Pilotless Aircraft Research Division and its activities as well. Those are slightly different activities undertaken in a slightly different manner with slightly different customers and clients, and all of them are a part of the NACA research model. That's the point I would make. With that, I am going to close. If there are questions or comments or anybody wants to hurl anything at me, now is your chance. If you wish to do so, I would ask you to come to the microphone over here, identify yourself, and we will go from there. Okay. Hearing none. Okay. Yes.
Dr. Launius, NACA was involved in all of this, and at the same time we had the laboratories from the Navy and the Army Air Corps doing other sorts of research. I know McCook Field did a lot of work in propellers. We had the folks up the road here doing a lot of hydrodynamics with flying boats and so on. Did NACA work with these people on the research side to make sure they weren't researching the same stuff, providing information sort of cross-channel between the different laboratories?
Yeah, okay. Absolutely, they worked with everybody that's out there doing these kinds of work. So the various military services that had their own R&D capabilities, McCook Field or whatever it happened to be. Yes, there's constant information that flows back and forth. Some of it's very informal. I mean, one of the things that happens, and shouldn't surprise anyone, that that things like the NACA inspection or that annual conference that takes place is a place where everybody sort of gathers. And as you might expect, as they would always do, the engineers would sit down and talk to each other. So it could be quite informal. But they were also involved in formulating some of the research questions. They were also involved in answering some of those questions, helping to shape how the structure of the research was going to go. Certain pieces of that research might be done by the Navy or the Army or somebody else as well, and would all factor together. It wasn't a perfect system in the sense that there wasn't perfect communication, but there was a lot more crosstalk than maybe we give them credit for. Anybody else? Okay.
Just to ask, back in those days, were there cases where the industry would come in and they would contract for the research facility, but they were keeping the data for themselves, and it was just basically renting the facilities?
Well, there was instances in which industry would provide funds to offset costs associated with research. I'm not aware of instances, and there's some people in the audience who actually have more knowledge about this than I do, and I see Glenn Bugo sitting here, and I see Jim Hansen, and people like that who probably know the answer to that question. But I'm not aware of individual outside entities coming into the NACA facility and actually doing the work. They might be with the engineers at some point, helping in some way, but usually if there was an arrangement like that, the NACA performed the research, gave it back to them, and it was work for hire in many ways. And this was a source of contention, to be perfectly honest. Obviously, the more well-heeled industry organizations could afford to do this, and they might be quite willing to do that. But since this is a facility that's paid for by tax dollars and the researchers are government employees, should they be engaged in that? That was a constant sort of push me, pull you in terms of discussions about these sorts of issues. But they did do some of that, yes. Jason.
Hi, Jason Callahan. I'm curious about the relative size of the NACA during these different periods of research and development. So you said in the 20s and 30s when they were sort of focused on technical reports as opposed to in the war years or the post-war years. What were the sizes of the NACA during this time?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the agency began obviously very small. And it wasn't until 1920 that the Langley facility was actually sort of stood up and started operating. And, for the first few years, you've got a couple hundred people. So it's not a large organization at all. There's a small staff that's in Washington, mostly John Victory and George Lewis and people like that. And then you've got these volunteers, and they were volunteers who were members of the committee. It stayed relatively small until the 1930s. It began to be plussed up in response to the war threat that everybody saw by the latter part of the 1930s. And of course, it was just one facility until Ames and Lewis Center. It didn't become Lewis Center until after his death. That's a little bit later, but the Cleveland and the Bay Area facilities were opened. And at that point, you move from a few hundred employees to a few thousand. But it's still a small operation. It continues to grow through World War II and sort of tops out 1945-ish. There's obviously some decline in the aftermath of the war, but not as much as you might think. And there's something else I guess I should say about this. The NACA, I mean, there are engineers that come out of schools, and if you're interested in aviation in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and I would suggest even right up to today, the gold standard for a place to work would be the NACA or NASA, where you could do this great cutting-edge research. I mean, if you weren't motivated by money, obviously, if that wasn't the principal driver, doing these very rewarding research projects would be a big attraction. Bob Gilruth has a very insightful interview that is available, and you can all read it online if you wish, that was conducted by folks here in the museum, and he talks about coming out of the University of Minnesota in 1927, and my gosh, he could have gone to all these various places, and he didn't want to. He wanted to be an NACA researcher and do that cutting-edge research. And I think that's replicated over and over and over again. The sense of collegiality, the sense of fulfillment that one can have by undertaking a research project and seeing it through to fruition made the NACA a unique place to work. And a lot of it was pretty basic research, not specifically tied to an individual engineering problem associated with one airplane, but something broader than that. And that was very attractive to a lot of people. And sort of a non-hierarchical approach that was present in the NACA that certainly wasn't present in the military research labs or a lot of other places that one might think of where you could engage in some of this type of work. And as I said, it's a place that a lot of people wanted to be. And competition was pretty great to get there. Anybody else?
Great talk, Roger. Jim Hansen, Auburn University.
By the way, before Jim starts, for those of you who don't know, he is the historian of Langley. Not anymore, but he's written 2 books about the history of that center, and they are standard works, and I copped from them liberally to do this paper.
Well, I'm especially glad I came up here now. So, Roger, one aspect of the NACA model that I'd like to hear you talk about is what I would guess I would call the relative invisibility of the organization compared to NASA. And I mean, there were people even up to 1957 in the United States that wouldn't, I don't know if you had a poll taken, that wouldn't even know about NACA. And that's certainly not true for NASA. And part of it was the size of the staff. Some of it was the budget wasn't all that big.
Right.
And the invisibility of NACA with the public had some advantages for the agency. One thing about the research, when I looked at your chart about the model, is the engineers at these laboratories, because, I mean, they obviously were scrutinized by their bosses in Washington, but they also did a lot of things that they, I mean, it wasn't just that they were responding to military or industry requests for, you know, studies of this or that. They were coming up with their own ideas.
Sure.
And they were bootlegging a lot of things that even their bosses in Washington sometimes didn't know about. The most famous incident being the thermonuclear fusion experiment that Eastman Jacobs and Arthur Kantrowitz are involved in the 1930s,
Right.
which when George Lewis finds out about it, he shuts it down pretty quickly. But I just wondered if you could talk about that model and how you know, the fact that it was so small and it didn't have much of a public affairs operation. Kristen Starr will talk about that later in the conference. How that fits into the model and how that might translate, good or bad, to to the idea of using the NACA model more for NASA.
Right. Yeah, good. That's a good point. And they did fly under the radar quite a bit. There's no question about that. Part of that was just the nature of the fact that it's a small organization and doesn't have much of a public stature. It's certainly not doing spectacular sort of rocket launches most of the time. There's some stuff out at out at Wallops, as I said, in the 1940s and 50s, but most of those are not. They certainly don't stack up to the kinds of activities that NASA was engaged in with human spaceflight effort. And I guess I would suggest that the relative invisibility of the NACA was really built around this kind of question that it wasn't viewed as a public relations activity in ways that the NASA human spaceflight program was in the 1960s. I mean, yes, human spaceflight is a big issue. It costs a lot of money, but it's also viewed as a Cold War initiative, and we want everybody to see what's going on here and what NASA can do. So there is a concerted effort to make sure that everybody sees what's going on with that. And that was something that the NACA never had to worry about. I would also suggest, however, that some of those X-plane programs, without trying to do so, got some attention. It's obviously not shooting John Glenn into orbit, but it's not insignificant as well. So there's a little bit of both in both sides, But yeah, the invisibility was real, largely because it wasn't meant to be something that everybody was going to view in the same way that the NASA programs were for human spaceflight. All right. Anybody got anything else? With that, I will, if not, I will yield back my time, and we will take a short break, I believe. About 5-minute break. So thank you all very much.